Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a good week, restful, working around the house, trying to tidy things up, doing a little decluttering, which is something that I don't normally do. I am such a hoarder, but I've decided to try and declutter some of my life. I've done a few trips to the Goodwill. Other than that, I really haven't done much. Just working on the podcast, doing some writing. I have a couple side projects that I'm working on right now, and that takes up a lot of my time. If you have suggestions for future episodes, you are welcome to email me at thebitterwitness@gmail.com. Or if you just want to drop an email and say, hey, I'm listening, that would be great too. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe on Spotify or sign up on Patreon and be a supporter. On Apple Podcasts, if you could rate and review the show, it really helps. It goes into the algorithm and all that jazz. Things I don't understand. Well, the puppies are sleeping beside me on the floor. It's been lightning and thundering here in my little corner of Ontario, so the puppies have been sleeping close by. I don't know how a 120-pound hound dog is terrified of lightning and thunder, but nonetheless, she is. So they're both lying beside me. So Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax, while I tell you about the disappearance of the Jack family. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan, and all of those who loved them. I acknowledge you, and I send my love to you wherever you may be. Trigger warning for this episode, we will be discussing the generational trauma that is a direct result of the residential school system in Canada. Our case today takes us out to British Columbia, to a section of highway known as the Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears refers to a 725-kilometer length of Highway 16 in British Columbia, where many women, mostly Indigenous, have disappeared or been found murdered. The Highway of Tears runs from Prince Rupert on the northwest coast of British Columbia to the central interior city of Prince George. 23 First Nations border Highway 16. The region is characterized by poverty and until 2017 lacked adequate public transportation, which forced many locals to resort to hitchhiking as a form of transit. It's known as the Highway of Tears because more than 40 people, mostly Indigenous and mostly women, have gone missing or were murdered on this stretch of road in the last few decades. Indigenous women account for more than half of all victims considered by police to be associated with the Highway of Tears killings. In 2014, convicted serial rapist Gary Taylor Handlin faced charges for killing 11-year-old Catherine Mary Herbert in 1975 and 12-year-old Monica Jack in 1978. Monica was the youngest known Highway of Tears victim, and she had been riding her bike along the highway when Handlin abducted her. Monica's bike was found soon after she went missing, but her remains weren't discovered until 1995, even though investigators and family members had suspected Handlin in the case. His arrest only came after new evidence came to light. He was sentenced to life in prison in January of 2019. But in fact, Monica Jack, no relation to the Jack family we're discussing today, is not the youngest victim of the Highway of Tears. On August 1st, 1989, Ronnie Jack was sitting inside the First Leader pub drinking a beer and trying to blow off some steam. The 26-year-old was dealing with a lot of stress currently. He was broke, he had lost his job because of a back injury which happened at that job. the job that was barely providing for his small family, but providing nonetheless. Shame had started to creep inside his mind. Shame because he and his wife Doreen had had to apply for welfare. He felt like he had failed his two sons, Russell, who was 9, and Ryan, who was 4. As Ronnie was drowning his sorrows in a draught, a man came and sat beside him at the bar. The two men acknowledged each other with a nod of their head. Eventually, the two started talking. Light conversation about the weather, what do you think of this or that, you know, the usual things. Eventually, after a few more pints, Ronnie started to vent, telling the man how hard it was right now to make ends meet and for him to find another job. The man seemed to empathize with Ronnie's situation and informed Ronnie that it was his lucky day. The man was a foreman for a logging company, and he had come down to Prince George to find a couple men and women to fill a few spots they had open at the camp. Ronnie was immediately interested. He asked the man what the job was. The man was looking for a bucker and a cook. Both positions were for a 2-week stint up at the camp. A tree bucker is the person who cuts a fallen tree into logs. This prepares them for transport to the sawmills. Usually, these logs are in the 30 to 35 foot range. Think Final Destination. Ronnie told the man that his wife Doreen could cook and the family could use the money, but they had a little problem. What would they do with their 2 sons? The boys were too young to leave alone for 2 weeks, and no one would be able to take the boys for that long. Miraculously, the man told Ronnie that he could bring his boys with him. At the logging camp, they had a daycare, as many of the men who worked the trees brought their families with them as they were gone for weeks at a time. Ronnie couldn't believe his luck. Running into this man at the bar, he couldn't wait to get home and tell Doreen. But then he also remembered they had no way to get to the logging camp. They didn't own a car. Ronnie shook the man's hand and told him thanks, but we can't get there with no vehicle. The man smiled at Ronnie and said, "Buddy, you and your wife and kids can ride up with me. I have to go back up to the camp anyways." Ronnie asked the man if he was sure. He didn't want to feel like a burden, especially since the man had already offered him so much. The man patted Ronnie on the shoulder and said, "It's no problem at all. Don't worry about it, buddy. Go on, go tell your wife the good news, and I'll swing by your place in a couple of hours and pick all of you up." Ronnie thanked the man and left the bar and ran home. He told Doreen the entire story. Doreen couldn't believe the story her husband was telling her, but Ronnie was so enthusiastic about everything, she knew it had to be the truth. Ronnie called his mom and told her about the job offer and that they were leaving that night. Ronald told his mother that the camp was 5 miles past Bednesty in the Cluculls Lake area, that they would be gone for about 10 to 14 days, and that the camp had a daycare available, so they were going to take the boys with them. About 1 o'clock in the wee hours of the morning, Ronnie and Doreen loaded their 2 sleeping boys into the man's dark truck and hopped in themselves. They were off on an adventure together. As a family, they were looking towards better times, making some money and making ends meet. The Jack family was never heard from or seen again. The police investigated the missing family and did a search along the Highway of Tears, but nothing was found. There was no trace of the Jack family anywhere. As well, the RCMP went to several logging camps, and not one of them was able to corroborate that a man had been sent down to Prince George to find employees. The RCMP stated that having a daycare at a logging camp was highly unusual. The RCMP believes that foul play is the most likely explanation for the disappearance of the Jack family. Then, on January 28, 1996, at 8:30 a.m., a man called the RCMP. The anonymous caller stated the Jack family are buried in the south end of Cordy's Ranch, The call was traced back to Stony Creek in the Vanderhoof area, but the caller has never been identified. In 2019, on August 28th through the 30th, the RCMP conducted an excavation on the south end of Vanderhoof, but uncovered no evidence relating to the Jacks. And that was the last clue regarding the disappearance of the Jack family. Sadly, like most cases involving missing or murdered Indigenous people from Canada, there isn't much to this story. It also was not picked up by the news, which isn't something shocking in Canada. It happens quite often that crimes involving Indigenous people are sent to the back page of the newspaper. If this was a white family, I'm sure this would have grabbed headlines and front page news across the country for quite a long time. Instead, the story of the disappearance of an entire family of people fell below the fold on the majority of newspapers in this country. Let's take a look at what we do know about the Jack family and their disappearance. The Jack family was of the Cheslata Carrier Nation. I'm going to give you a history on the Cheslata Carrier Nation, not only because it shows the resilience of the people of this nation and the mindset that Ronnie and Doreen were raised in, but it also will give you some insight as to how Indigenous people have been treated by past Canadian governments. The history of the Cheslata Carrier Nation is fascinating and tragic. The people are a testament to survival. What this nation of people has been put through by those who came in and took control over them and their lands is nothing short of horrific. Currently, members live on 17 different reserves, which are scattered throughout an area known as the South Side. It is a densely wooded area in the interior of British Columbia. Historically, the nation had settled along the shores of both the Cheslata and Murray Lakes. They had created a complex system of roads, trails, and paths which connected all of their small villages to the larger communities of Grassy Plains, Fraser Lake, and Vanderhoof. In 1950, the government of British Columbia gave the rights to all of the water in the Cheslata traditional territory to the Aluminum Company of Canada. You know this company better as Alcan. Alcan decided to build a giant hydroelectric dam on the Nechako River to power their factories and such. This dam would flood the Utsa, Tatachuk, and Tatsa rivers. By flooding these rivers, a 400-kilometer-long reservoir would be created, and the entire territory of the Cheslata Nation would be completely flooded. In 1952, Alcan came to the Cheslata people and told them that they would get the people new land, building, equipment, and livestock. As well, Alcan promised the nation that they would cover all costs that arose from the relocation. But Alcan told the people of Cheslata that they had to leave their homes and their land immediately. The Cheslata Nation was given 2 weeks to leave their territory. Alcan told the people, "Don't worry about your belongings. Just take what you can carry and go. You can all come back in the summer and get the rest of your things." The people left on foot and walked to the grassy plains to settle. But as soon as the people left, Alcan workers came into the villages and looted what they wanted from the buildings and then burned every building. When the Cheslata people arrived on the grassy plains, there were no resources there for them to rebuild. They had to live in tents. And over a year after they were told to leave their land and homes, the Cheslata people were still living inside tents. Alcan did give some money to the nation. However, the Indian agent was able to secure 11 parcels of land for the Cheslata people. An Indian agent, for those who don't know, was a representative of the Canadian government who oversaw all business on the Indigenous reserves. These positions were usually never filled by an Indigenous person. Normally, the Indian agent was a white man. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Indigenous people were considered and treated as wards of the state, meaning the government was responsible for the care of all Indigenous peoples in Canada, because the government of Canada felt that Indigenous peoples were incapable of governing themselves. Thus, the Indian agents were sent to the reserves to oversee the day-to-day operations of the people on the reserves. Indian agents had complete control over every aspect of every person living on a reserve, where they ate, what they ate, where they were housed, what they sold, whether someone was allowed to go off the reserve or not, where and when they fished. They controlled the distribution of rations to the families, controlled all the monies of the nations, and assured that assimilation was taking place. Assimilation was done by ensuring that the indigenous children were sent to residential schools, which we will talk about a little later. Needless to say, Indian agents for the most part were horrible people who, in many cases, allowed the power that they held over the indigenous people to overtake them, and horrific atrocities were committed at the hands of many of the Indian agents towards indigenous peoples. To get back to the Cheslata Carrier Nation history, the Indian agent was able to secure 11 parcels of land for the people to resettle on, but he had used the compensation money that was given from Alcan for the relocation costs. So basically, it was the Cheslata people buying the new land, not Alcan. When the Cheslata people finally got their new land, they went back to the Indian agent and said, "We need equipment, livestock, we need to build homes." And at that time, the Indian agent told the Cheslata people, "Sorry, but these new lands are not part of your reserves. Therefore, you don't qualify for any help from the government." Something that the Cheslata people didn't realize was that once those rivers all flooded together, creating the reservoir, all their cemeteries were also flooded. This flooding disturbed every grave of every member that had ever been buried and caused the caskets with the people inside to float on the new reservoir. The Cheslata people spent the next 2 or 3 years collecting all the caskets and the remains of their loved ones from the reservoir. According to the Cheslata Carrier Nation website, the result of the immediate forced eviction of the Cheslata people created a social breakdown amongst the nation, which in turn led to the premature death of nearly 50% of the Cheslata population. When the Cheslata people walked out of their lands, their cycle of life completely collapsed. The effects of forced eviction and the devastation of the Cheslata Carrier Nation are still felt today within the Cheslata communities. On March 29, 2019, the Cheslata Carrier Nation and the province of British Columbia signed agreements to address historic wrongs originating with the construction of the Kenny Dam and the creation of the Nechako Reservoir. That just gives you a little background of the indigenous nation that Ronnie and Doreen Jack came from. Unfortunately, there is not a lot known about Ronnie's upbringing. However, Doreen was one of the countless indigenous children who were taken from their families and sent to residential schools by the government of Canada. If you are unaware of what residential schools are, the residential school system in Canada was based on the government-stated goals of assimilating Indigenous peoples. The government decided that a residential school system for the Indigenous children was the most effective way to quote-unquote civilize the Indigenous. I'm going to read you one quote from, and I apologize, but this is not my writing. This was written in 1879 by Nicholas Flood Davin. It is, quote, "a report on industrial schools for Indians and half-breeds," unquote. Inside that report, it was discussing why the residential school system was something that needed to happen in Canada. This just makes me want to vomit, but this quote by Nicholas Flood Davin from 1879 describes the absolute mindset of the Canadian government at the time. Quote, "If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions," unquote. So earlier I discussed the Indian agents. The Indian agents would arrange for the children to be taken from their families on the reserves and sent to these residential schools. These residential schools were mostly off reserve, so most of the children that attended had to actually live inside these residential schools. And the entire goal of a residential school was to assimilate Indians into Canadian society. They were operated by the Canadian government in partnership with the Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. There were residential schools in all Canadian provinces and territories except Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. Residential schools operated in Canada from the 1870s until the 1990s, with the last residential school closing in 1996. The fact that we still had an active residential school in 1996 in Canada embarrasses me as a Canadian. It is estimated that over 150,000 Aboriginal, Inuit, and Métis children attended Canadian residential schools. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their Aboriginal languages. They were all required to speak English or French, and they were beaten if they didn't. They were also required to adopt the religious denominations of the school. They were forced to have a style of prayer consistent with the school denomination. They would forcibly shave or cut the hair of all Indigenous children. The children were segregated based on gender. Brothers and sisters had absolutely no contact. Within these schools, these children were subjected to sexual assault, electric shock, force feeding of their own vomit when sick. They were exposed to freezing temperatures outside with improper clothing. The teachers, which were the nuns and the priests of each residential school, vilified the Indigenous cultural traditions. The absolute brutality that these children went through, there are no words to describe what these people did to these children. They were children. Many of them were murdered within the residential school system and buried in unmarked graves on the land surrounding the schools. Many of the children to this day have not been found. Doreen attended one of these schools. The fact that she survived is a testament to how strong this woman was, how dedicated to life she was. All right. So now that you have a history of the way that Aboriginal people have been treated throughout Canada's history, I want to dive into the case a little bit, look at suspects, look at theories, and then give you my thoughts. The suspect in this case, there's only one. It's the man Ronnie was seen with and the man who was driving the dark pickup truck as the family jumped in and drove away. So the man did exist. He was at the bar with Ronnie, and they were able to get a description of the man. And there are some composite sketches that I'm going to post on the Bitter Witness Facebook page, and I'll try and put it in the show notes, but I don't know how well that'll work. But it will be on the Facebook page. The man was white, stood about 6'5", 6'6", with a full beard and mustache. He was between the ages of 39 and 45 in 1985. He weighed about 200 to 275. He had reddish-brown hair and was last seen wearing a baseball cap, red checkered work shirt, faded blue jeans, a nylon blue jacket, and work boots with fringe over the toes. Share the composite sketch of the suspect. Remember, this sketch was made in 1989, so this is what he would have looked like then. Was this guy actually from a logging camp, or was he just a serial killer looking for someone to get? If he was a serial killer, using the guise of taking the whole family to a logging camp for a 2-week stint gave him a 2-week head start on anyone looking for anyone from the Jack family. Let's get into the theories of what happened to the Jack family. One of the theories that has surfaced is that the man who was driving was drunk, and that this was just a horribly sad drinking and driving accident. The men were in a bar drinking. If you look at the Highway of Tears, going from Prince George to Prince Rupert, this is a densely wooded area with several rivers and lakes. Very easily, anywhere along this route, the man could have lost control of the truck and they could have careened into some water and the entire group could have drowned. Or, I know this sounds crazy, but moose are absolutely terrifying. They are so dangerous to come across on the road. If you get hit by a moose or if you hit a moose, your car will be totaled. And chances of you surviving are pretty slim to nil. So driving in the middle of the night, they'd been drinking. They were tired, I would imagine, because now it's like 2 a.m. There's a very good chance that there was a car accident of some kind. Maybe the car went down a steep incline and just has never been found. There are lakes and streams and rivers all along this stretch of highway. Very easily, the car could have gone into some water. This is a very solid theory. It happens quite often in Canada, especially up in the wilderness where there aren't that many people living, not a highly populated area. The problem with this is that they did search for the Jack family and no pickup truck was ever found. But that doesn't mean anything. It could be underwater. It could be in a ditch that no one can see. When you're looking from the top of a mountain, looking down, it is really hard to decipher certain things. You have to be very close to see them. It is a possibility that the truck has just been overlooked. Another theory that has surfaced is that of a serial killer, that Ronnie was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't put a lot of faith in this. If he wanted to kill someone, he could have just bought Ronnie a whole bunch of drinks, had him absolutely soused when he walked out of the door, and then easily overtaken Ronnie and killed him. I find it hard to believe that a killer would invite more people to join the party, especially if he was all by himself. Having 4 humans to control is a pretty big task, especially when you're threatening the children of the couple. They will fight to the death for their children. From all accounts that I've read, Ronnie and Doreen were devoted parents to the boys. And I feel that if someone was threatening the boys' lives, Doreen and Ronnie would do whatever they had to do to save their children. Now, if he had a partner that was waiting on the highway for him somewhere, that's a different story. Then it would be much easier to control all members of the Jack family. There is a third theory that I've read in one of my many Reddit dives. I give this theory absolutely no weight at all. Some people have suggested that Doreen and Ronnie were involved in drugs and there was a drug deal that went bad and they owed money and the guy that Ronnie met at the bar was the drug dealer and he came to collect, and when Ronnie didn't have the money, the man took the family. There are so many issues with this theory. Number one, Doreen and Ronnie never did drugs, never got in trouble by the law. And if it was a drug deal gone wrong and the guy was coming to kill them because they didn't have the money, wouldn't it have been easier to just kill them inside their home instead of getting them to pack for 2 weeks, load them all up in the truck, have a huge convoluted story of giving them jobs in a logging camp? It just seems excessive and wasteful for a killer to do. If they owed money and they were going to be killed, they wouldn't waste their time with this giant ruse of a job in a logging camp. My thoughts. I have so many questions about this case. My first question deals with the suspect. Someone has to know who this guy is. What are the chances that this guy has 0 friends and 0 family? Unless he's a fucking recluse living off the land in the mountains of BC, someone has had contact with this guy. My second question deals with the logging camp. Did it even exist? The RCMP said that they went to many of the logging camps in the area, but they didn't go to all of them. Why not? The RCMP has a responsibility to do its due diligence when searching for missing people. And this was an entire fucking family. In addition to this, the RCMP stated that it would be extremely rare for there to be a daycare at a logging camp. They're right. It would be extremely rare for there to be a daycare at a logging camp. And by making this statement publicly, they were able to sway the general population's thought process towards something suspicious and possible foul play. However, if wives are attending to the logging camp with their husbands and doing the cooking and the cleaning and the domesticity jobs that need to be done, it wouldn't be that uncommon for them to bring their children and the women all watch the children while the men are out doing the logging, would it? And that would be a kind of daycare. Normally, I back the police up in cases. However, there are way too many indicators that point towards the RCMP just fluffing this case off, most likely because it was a family of Indigenous people who went missing. My third and final question deals with the anonymous call that came in. I want to know how the RCMP was able to trace that call to a specific address and the caller is still unknown. If you have the address and you know what time that phone call came in, you just need to go to the house and find out who was there. And if they say that no one made the phone call or they don't know who made the phone call, that's where you start your investigation. You start diving into whoever's house that is. You start diving into their background. Whoever lives in that house, you start investigating their background. Then you spread out to their friends, their acquaintances, their contacts. At some point, you're going to find out who made the fucking phone call. I had a thought about this case. Now, to some of you, this may seem conspiracy theorist-ish, but I think it holds a little weight, and I think if you thought about it for a few seconds, you might agree with me. What if Ronnie was the intended target, and his family was killed to send a message to the rest of the community? Or there was no intended target, and Ronnie was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he and his family were murdered to send a message to the community. Back in the 70s and 80s, the Canadian government allowed logging corporations to go on to Aboriginal territory lands and clear cut. When that started happening, the logging blockades began. Logging blockades in Canada did not begin with Oka people. It began way back in the 70s. There was a very successful blockade in Clayoquot, I hope I said that right, BC, where an Aboriginal nation was successful in stopping a logging corporation from coming in and clear-cutting their land. What if logging protests and logging blockades were happening outside of Prince George, somewhere in that area, and the land that the community was trying to save was the land of the Cheslada Nation? And what if the logging corporation sent someone to send a message to the community? It has happened before. I dare say it will happen again. That could be why we haven't found any trace of the Jack family ever. I know that in reality, the Jack family is probably deceased. But I will not say that we won't ever know what happened to them, because the optimist in me feels that there's always a chance that we could find some of the remains of someone from the Jack family, or the truck, or something. And science has advanced by leaps and bounds since the Jack family went missing. So please, share the composite sketch. I'll also put up age-enhanced computerized sketches of all the members of the Jack family on the Facebook page. Take a look. Maybe they did just leave and start their life over again. I don't think they wouldn't have contact with their loved ones. Share the pictures. Let's get it out there. Let's give this case the attention that it deserves. And if the mass media won't do it, then let's do it ourselves. No matter what the different theories are, and no matter what the truth actually is as to what happened to the Jack family, one thing is true. There are family members here who miss and love them and wish that they could have just some semblance of closure to know what happened to their loved ones. Not knowing is more torture than any family member should ever have to bear. If you have any information about the disappearance of the Jack family or recognize any of the faces in the photos that are posted on the Bitter Witness Facebook page, you can contact Prince George RCMP at 250-561-3300. Or you can call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. It's such a sad case, and when you get into the Highway of Tears in Canada, there are so many missing people from that stretch of highway. It's so sad. The Highway of Tears has claimed too many lives over the past 50 years. And sadly, the Jack family are among that list. For a whole family to go missing like that it's just insane. And when you start to go down a rabbit hole and look at all the theories and what people say and what people think, your mind starts to run away with itself and you start imagining what happened. You can imagine the terror that they must have felt. I really hope that the Jack family are found one way or the other, just to give some answers to their families. Well, I hope you enjoyed that case. Please take a look at the Facebook page. And with that, I'm going to leave you for this week. Enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.